So how exactly do you win a war when nuclear weapons make traditional combat, well, completely impossible? It's one of the most terrifying yet absolutely fascinating questions of our time. Today, we're going to look at the current US-Iran conflict. But we're not just looking at it as some regional dispute. No, we're looking at it as a blueprint. It's a real-time unfolding playbook for a totally new breed of 21st century warfare.
Welcome to This Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here. We're diving into the twilight of the nation-state and the future of warfare. If you're a focused learner trying to understand the actual mechanics of modern geopolitics, you are in the exact right place. Because to make sense of all the bizarre tactics we see on the news today, we have to hit rewind. We need to look at the massive paradigm shifts over the past 300 years of human history.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the evolution of warfare and the birth of the nation-state. Then move through the total war of World War II. After that, we'll unpack the 21st century playbook, the color revolution strategy, and finally wrap up with fanaticism and the future. Let's jump right in.
Okay, here is our grand historical thesis. Every era's solution to winning a war inevitably creates the next era's ultimate problem. Think about it. In the 19th century, it was straightforward. Soldier versus soldier. You beat the enemy army on a battlefield, you win. But by the 20th century, states had grown so massive they could just endlessly replace troops. So the strategy had to shift to state versus production. You literally had to destroy the enemy's factories and cities. And today, in the 21st century, nuclear weapons and massive global populations mean direct destruction is basically suicidal. So the new paradigm is state versus population. You have to turn the civilians against their own government. Okay, let's look at how we actually got here.
Part 2. Birth of the nation-state. Let's talk about this vital shift from paying mercenaries to deploying actual citizens.
So pre-modern wars were fought mostly by professional mercenaries who were basically just collecting a paycheck. They wanted to look scary, sure, but they definitely didn't want to die. But then the French Revolution comes along and changes the math entirely. Enter Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract, arguing that human liberty is a divine right. Suddenly, you've got everyday French citizens literally running into cannon fire against European mercenaries, all because they believed fighting for liberty was better than living as a slave. France became an unstoppable juggernaut. Now, to counter this, German thinkers like Fichte and later Bismarck had to come up with a rival philosophy. They couldn't really use the social contract, so they built nationalism, based on shared language, culture, and blood.
And this whole shift was heavily powered by philosophy. Take Kant's categorical imperative, for example. He argued for universal moral laws, free will, and treating humans as the ultimate end, not just a means to an end. This really shaped Rousseau's idea of the general will, this vision of what society could be if it strived for total collective freedom. And this wasn't just some dusty academic theory. This was the exact psychological fuel that turned everyday French bakers and blacksmiths into totally fearless soldiers, letting them absolutely steamroll the cautious professional mercenaries of Europe.
Which brings us to the counter-reaction. Otto von Bismarck famously declared that the great questions of the day wouldn't be decided by speeches, but by, quote, iron and blood. To fight effectively, Bismarck realized he needed a massive, healthy population to serve as soldiers and to build weapons. So what did he do? He enacted some of the world's very first progressive worker reforms. We're talking health insurance, old age pensions, worker protections. But here's the wild irony. He didn't do this purely out of the goodness of his heart. He did it because the new metric for a state's survival was having a healthy, expanding supply of soldiers ready to fight.
Which moves us right along into the 20th century. Section 3, World War II and Total War, and the resulting game of capitalism. 40 to 60%. Let that sink in. As populations boomed thanks to these new nation-state models, simply killing soldiers on a battlefield became totally impossible. Nations would just send more. So the strategy shifted to destroying the state's civilian production capacity. That staggering percentage? That represents the physical destruction of major Japanese cities like Nagoya, Tokyo, and Yokohama during the massive American firebombing campaigns of World War II. The Allies didn't win just by having better battlefield tactics. They won because they could systematically wipe out the civilian populations and the factories powering the Axis war machines, all while their own factories back home stayed relatively safe.
So, after the unimaginable destruction of World War II, the global board desperately needed a reset. America stepped in and basically established a new game for the whole world to play: consumer capitalism. The premise was super simple: participate in global trade, work hard, and get rich. And honestly, this system was incredibly successful for decades. It fueled a massive population boom, taking us from about 2 billion people all the way up to the 8 billion we have today. However, as with any game played long enough, things eventually skew. Right now, that very system is destabilizing due to extreme wealth inequality, where a tiny fraction of players hold the wealth, and a vast majority are just drowning in debt.
And that leads us to a massive, looming question. Historically, when a system gets this unbalanced, nations go to war to burn it down and reset the board. But what happens when the game requires a reset today, and nuclear weapons make World War II-style combat utterly suicidal? You really can't just firebomb cities anymore without risking, well, total global annihilation.
And that brings us to the present day. Section 4, the 21st Century War Playbook, State versus Population.
Let's look at the current US-Iran conflict to really see this new game theory in action. In the past, the US might have used a shock and awe decapitation strike, right? Just bomb the leaders and the military bases. But Iran prepared for exactly that for 20 years by decentralizing its leadership and hiding factories deep inside mountains. So the strategy has to evolve. It becomes a slow, methodical warfare designed to turn a population against its own government. It unfolds in 3 really chilling phases. Phase 1, economic strangulation. Phase 2, inciting ethnic tension. And Phase 3, civilian infrastructure sabotage.
This new playbook is definitely not about troops shooting at troops. It's about blockading Kog Island to choke off 90% of Iran's oil exports to China. It's about positioning forces near borders to encourage local ethnic minorities to rise up, forcing the state to constantly fight these internal brush fires. It's about strategically destroying water dams and targeting the specific roads and railway networks that literally feed the 10 million people living in Tehran. Now, as an impartial observer of game theory, you can really see the cold logic here. You destroy a population's access to water, electricity, and food. The civilians become desperate, they get angry. And crucially, it is so much easier for them to direct that anger right at their own leaders and at some foreign military they can't even see.
Which leads to even more unconventional tactics. Listen to this fascinating quote from Lyndon B. Johnson way back in 1962. "He who controls the weather will control the world." This introduces the highly debated concept of weather warfare. Now, we do know that during the Vietnam War, the U.S. ran Operation Popeye, where they successfully used cloud seeding to extend the monsoon season and wash out enemy supply trails. Fast forward to 2012, Iranian leaders actually explicitly accused the U.S. of orchestrating severe droughts over Iran by seeding clouds so they prematurely dropped their rain over places like Dubai. Look, whether that's fully scientifically scalable today or not, the underlying theory remains incredible. If you can engineer a drought, you can literally starve a nation into collapse without firing a single bullet.
All right, Section 5, the Color Revolution Strategy. This is the strategy of explicitly organizing civilian uprisings. If you want to tackle a hostile government today, here's the playbook. You don't send an invading army. Instead, you fund foreign NGOs. You bring young people from that target country abroad to train them in protest organization. You manipulate social media algorithms to galvanize the masses, and you quietly bribe local security services to just stand down when the protests start. We saw elements of this all throughout the Arab Spring. We even see bizarre anomalies, like a recent anti-government protest in Nepal, a country where English is definitely not widely spoken, where youths were holding up signs saying "OK Boomer" and "Time's Up" in perfect English. As analysts point out, those signs aren't really for the local Nepalese government. They're performance metrics for the foreign funders who are backing the unrest. So how in the world does a targeted country possibly defend against this multi-layered, insidious 21st century siege? Section 6, Fanaticism and the Future, the Counter Strategy. Game theory suggests there is really only one effective defense when your economy is strangled and your infrastructure is collapsing, and that is eschatology. It's a belief system emphasizing that profound suffering is actually part of a divine plan. It tells a starving, desperate population that their pain makes them invincible, and it rewards extreme martyrdom with direct entry to heaven. I know, it sounds extreme, but the chilling mathematical reality of game theory is that a nation doesn't actually need its whole population to believe this. If just 10 to 20% of a population commits to absolute fanaticism, the state can survive the siege.
And we have a really stark historical anecdote for this. Look at the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. Iraq had a professional army, tanks, helicopters, and massive backing from global superpowers. Iran, on the other hand, was reeling from a revolution and had almost zero traditional military hardware. So their countermeasure? Instilling absolute, total fearlessness in their youth. You had 16-year-old kids literally sprinting at heavily armored professional tanks with nothing but a rifle and a hand grenade. Yes, most were killed, but their screaming, absolute fearlessness completely paralyzed the invading Iraqi forces with pure terror. This fanaticism galvanized the population and successfully turned the tide of the entire war. Lack of self-preservation literally defeated heavy machinery.
But there is a second, alternative counter-strategy for governments under siege. If the enemy's goal is to provoke your population into overthrowing you, well, your ultimate defense is total population management. This points directly to the inevitable, draconian rise of the AI surveillance state. Governments will basically be forced to use advanced artificial intelligence, extreme digital surveillance, and strict resource management to instantly identify and crush domestic unrest before it even spreads. To survive a 21st century war, a state has to effectively wage a silent, constant war of suppression against its own restive citizens.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative question. We've seen how warfare evolved from killing soldiers to destroying factories to starving and manipulating civilian populations. If the only viable defenses against this insidious modern warfare are either extreme religious fanaticism or living under a suffocating total AI surveillance state, can a 21st century war ever truly be won by anyone? Or are the populations just destined to lose no matter who the state actors are? It's a grim reality for sure, but understanding these structural playbooks is absolutely crucial to making sense of the geopolitical chessboard we see today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning what you see, and I'll catch you next time.